They called Mar-a-Lago the crown jewel of Palm Beach, a winter palace built for a woman who had everything. But hidden behind its carved ceilings and coral stone is a single line in a forgotten agreement that whispers about a missing heir and a price that could never be paid in money. Tonight, we are not just visiting a mansion. We are opening a bargain sealed in ink, silence, and sacrifice. When you step through the gates of Mar-a-Lago, you are not simply entering a luxurious estate on the Florida coast. You are walking into the afterglow of America's Gilded Age, the world that created Marjorie Merriweather Post. She was the daughter of an empire built on breakfast tables and grocery shelves, an heiress shaped by the ruthless optimism of 1870 to 1910, when fortunes were carved out of coal, steel, sugar, railroads, and food, and when every alliance could be reduced to a signature on heavy paper. By the time her own palace began to rise above the shoreline, her name was already spoken in the same breath as the great families of that era. But not all of those conversations were meant to be remembered. The document that brought us here does not sparkle like her jewels or stand as tall as her ballroom ceilings. It is a worn page, recently unearthed from a private legal archive, referring to the creation and maintenance of the Mar-a-Lago estate, and, almost as an afterthought, to a separate understanding regarding a designated heir, to be kept strictly confidential. The clause is brief, then abruptly interrupted, as if someone stopped writing mid-sentence. Below it, there are signs of erasure. Words scraped, ink diluted, a margin note cut off by scissors. Other files from the same period are missing altogether, replaced by neat typed indexes that politely insist there is nothing else to see. Contemporary society pages painted Marjorie as a symbol of triumph, the elegant hostess, the patron of culture, the woman who turned inherited wealth into social power. But behind those glowing columns, rumors circulated of an internal dispute that never reached the courts, of a child who was spoken of only in hallways, of a negotiation that moved money, land titles, and loyalties in ways that never made it into official biographies. One witness who hinted at knowing more gave a single interview in a minor Florida paper and never spoke on the matter again. Later, that edition's archive was lost in a fire. Letters from the same year arrived in family collections with entire paragraphs cut out. Bank ledgers record transfers to unnamed beneficiaries, then shift abruptly to coded initials. This is how the elite of the Gilded Age and its aftermath protected themselves, not with dramatic confessions, but with revised contracts, burned correspondence, and carefully curated memory. An agreement here, a silenced witness there, a ledger page quietly removed until all that remains is the official story. The brilliant heiress, the shining estate, the perfect lineage. Have you ever heard a story like this hidden inside a Gilded Age mansion, where the stones themselves seem to know who was written out so that others could remain untouchable? If this case reminds you of another sealed room, another forgotten heir, share it below. Your comment may be the missing piece someone else has been looking for. This channel exists to reveal what the elite have tried to erase. So like this video, subscribe before you lose sight of it, and keep these investigations alive in the algorithm they cannot control. Because at the heart of Mar-a-Lago's origin lies a question that ordinary tour guides never raise. What did Marjorie Merriweather Post agree to give up, and whom did she agree to forget, so that her palace and her position would stand? That quiet, unsettling clause about a secret heir is only the beginning. And to understand the price she paid, we have to start with the empire she inherited and the image she was determined to protect. The empire Marjorie Merriweather Post inherited did not begin with Mar-a-Lago, but by the time the first limestone blocks were laid along the Florida coast, every inch of that estate was already carrying the weight of decisions made in drawing rooms, law offices, and quiet, closed-door negotiations. In the official version, she is the brilliant heiress who transformed a breakfast cereal fortune into a modern dynasty. In the version that lives in the margins of contracts and in the pauses of old employees, she is a woman who kept walking down the aisle hoping to secure stability, only to find that each marriage tightened the walls around her. Society reporters saw the glittering receptions, the gowns and the jewels. The servants saw the evenings when she crossed empty corridors with her shoulders held too straight. envelope crushed in one hand, as if sheer posture could stop a scandal from forming. From the outside, her unions looked like a logical progression. Respectable husbands, chosen from the right families, the right institutions, the right circles. A well-placed stockbroker here, a powerful financier there, later a diplomat whose presence in Washington made her seem not just wealthy, but essential to the national image. This is how a Gilded Age heiress graduated into a figure of the early American Golden Age, not by romance, but by strategy. Each marriage came with new contracts, marital settlements drafted on thick paper, inheritance clauses adjusted, trusts expanded or restricted. Witnesses recall not bouquets, but long meetings with lawyers, the scratch of pens, the slow nods of men who never appeared in society photos. The language was always precise, but if you trace those agreements across time, there are tiny fractures, an unexplained revision in one year, a temporary provision removed in the next, an unnamed dependent whose description evaporates in later drafts. One former household employee, interviewed decades later under the promise that their name would never be printed, described the way Marjorie reacted when those contracts overlapped with her private life. They remembered her sitting alone in a small study away from the main salons, the French doors slightly open to the sound of the ocean, a legal folder spread before her. From the hallway you wouldn't hear sobbing or raised voices. You would notice instead the careful way she straightened each page, the way she paused on a line mentioning issue of this union, fingers pressing down harder, the way one sheet was folded and refolded until its edges began to fray. On a side table, a silver frame stood face down, its glass catching only the reflection of the ceiling. The employee never saw the photograph inside, but they remembered the impression that the picture had once mattered and was no longer supposed to. In the official biographies, a lost heir might be explained away with a polite phrase, an illness, a fragile child who did not survive, a private sorrow not for public consumption. But the testimony hints at something less tidy, at a living presence written around rather than after the contracts. There are internal memos in family archives that speak vaguely of delicate adjustments to future inheritance, of avoiding confusion as to legitimate succession. One draft of an agreement, preserved only in carbon copy, uses the phrase designated heir under private understanding, then replaces it with a simpler issue as recognized by the parties in the executed version. It is in these erased records that the outline of a hidden heir begins to form, not as a melodramatic secret child in the attic, but as a name that once appeared on paper and was deliberately removed. This is exactly the territory we explore here and beyond the Golden Halls, the Golden Age secrets of families who built forbidden rooms not just in stone, but in law. The logic of succession among the elite was brutal in its elegance. Children born in the right to marriage received titles, trusts, seats at the table. Those who arrived at the wrong time, through the wrong union, or under circumstances that threatened a carefully curated image, could be quietly diverted, given another surname, another guardian, another narrative. The public saw shining facades and formal portraits. The hidden heirs saw closed doors that never appeared on the original floor plans. Silent witnesses, like that former employee, carried these stories in their memories until age thinned their voices and blurred their details, leaving only atmosphere. The sound of papers being burned in the fireplace one winter evening, the faint smell of smoke mixing with perfume, the sight of a ledger page torn out with more force than necessary. Meanwhile, as Mar-a-Lago rose above the shoreline in the 1920s, it became both a stage and a cage for this dark legacy. Architects and artisans worked under clear instructions, no expense spared, no vista left unimpressive. Guests marveled at Spanish tiles, Venetian ceilings, carved doorways that seemed to open into endless light. Yet the people who lived below those ceilings remember other details. A section of corridor in the private wing that staff were instructed never to use, a room whose door remained locked except during rare visits from specific legal advisors, a basement storage area where boxes marked private correspondence were stacked in perfect rows, some of them later found empty, their contents destroyed. To the untrained eye, Mar-a-Lago was simply the culmination of a lifetime of privilege. To those who knew how the elite managed scandal, the estate looked like a carefully choreographed answer to questions that must never be asked. Newspaper society pages framed each of Marjorie's marriages as a chapter in an aspirational fairy tale. The heiress and the financier, the heiress and the diplomat, the heiress and the industrialist. They never mentioned the clauses that protected existing children at the expense of others, or the stipulations requiring discretion regarding prior familial obligations. Press manipulation was an art form perfected since the high Gilded Age. Friendly columnists invited to carefully staged dinners, photographs approved before publication, rumors about rivals quietly encouraged so that attention would drift elsewhere. When one small regional paper hinted at persistent whispers concerning contested succession, its follow-up issues contained a retraction so vague it raised more questions than answers. And then, years later, the bound volume for that year vanished from the local archive. Inside this network of erased records and silent witnesses, Marjorie's personal cost did not take the shape of a public scandal, but of a private narrowing of choices. Each time she signed her name under a new marital agreement, she shored up her image as a respectable matriarch, and at the same time, sealed away another fragment of a life that did not fit the official mold. The staffer who spoke of her mentioned one moment that never left them. Late one night, after a tense visit from advisors, she walked out onto a balcony overlooking the dark gardens of Mar-a-Lago. She did not cry or speak. She simply rested both hands on the stone balustrade, staring out toward the invisible horizon, while behind her, on a desk inside, an ashtray held the curled remains of a half-burned letter. The signature at the bottom had survived long enough to be recognized, then collapsed into ash with the next gust of wind from the open doors. Faced with this kind of information, folded, redacted, and almost successfully buried, what would you do? If you were the employee who saw too much, the relative who recognized a face in a photograph that no longer appears in the family tree, the lawyer who kept one extra copy of a page that should have been destroyed, would you speak, knowing the weight of a name attached to a fortune? Or would you stay silent and let the official version stand? These are the questions that echo in the forbidden rooms of estates like Mar-a-Lago, in the corridors that visitors never tour, where the past still lingers like dust in the cracks of the stone. Because somewhere in the archives connected to this house, whether in a bank vault, a private law office, or a mislabeled box in a storage room beneath those famous ceilings, there is at least one document that refuses to fully disappear. On it, a line once carried the name of someone who did not fit the clean narrative of the Post dynasty. Today, what remains is a strip of paper where that name has been violently crossed out, the ink pressed so deep it nearly tore the page, leaving a faint indentation in the fiber. And when you look at that scar in the paper under the right light, it feels less like an error corrected and more like a voice that was pushed into silence, still pushing back from underneath. By the time the first scaffolds rose along the edge of the Palm Beach shoreline, Mar-a-Lago was already more than a dream on paper. It was a calculated declaration. In an age when the last great estates of the Gilded Age were either being dismantled or held onto at enormous cost, Marjorie Merriweather Post chose to do something few women of her generation would have dared. She decided to build a palace large enough and strange enough to outlive the whispers surrounding her. The plans arrived rolled in heavy tubes, spread across long tables in New York and Florida, lines of ink mapping out courtyards, loggias, galleries, and a central tower that seemed to reach for a permanence money alone could not guarantee. Architects and designers spoke of Mediterranean influences, old-world craftsmanship, a house between the sea and the lake that could host presidents and princes. No one mentioned that, from the very beginning, parts of those plans were never meant for public eyes. The process itself looked like a Gilded Age spectacle resurrected on the coast. Trains delivering carved stone and imported tiles, trucks carrying marble, Craftsmen who had once worked on Fifth Avenue mansions now summoned south for this new commission. Society columns described Marjorie walking the construction site in light-colored dresses and wide-brimmed hats, pausing to comment on a balcony line here, a fountain placement there. Workers remember other details, the way she sometimes stopped when passing a particular section of foundation, fingers tightening on the edge of a blueprint before giving a quiet instruction that didn't make it into the official notes. On more than one occasion, foremen received revised drawings in unmarked envelopes, substitutions for previous sheets, marked only with the word "updated" in a precise, unfamiliar hand. Among the surviving construction maps, there is a pattern that only emerges when you lay them side by side. Early drafts show a clear, symmetrical layout. Guest wings, service corridors, storage areas, all labeled in tidy script. Later versions introduce shaded sections along certain hallways, small rectangles in the basement level, a narrow space running parallel to a private corridor. Instead of room names, these areas carry a simple notation, R or restricted. No explanation, no legend. In some blueprints, these zones are faint, almost tentative. In others, the ink is darker, decisive, as if someone wanted to be sure those boundaries could not be misunderstood. When the house was finally completed, many of these spaces were either inaccessible to ordinary staff or described vaguely as mechanical and utility in maintenance logs. Yet inspection of the physical walls decades later reveals sealed doors, bricked-over archways, and cavities that do not align with the most commonly circulated floor plans. Within the culture of Golden Age secrets, this kind of architectural discrepancy is almost a signature. The great families of the era understood that walls could do more than hold up ceilings. They could hold stories in place too. Hidden heirs could be kept out of view without ever being locked in a physical room, but the house itself could still carry the imprint of decisions made about them. A servant staircase that once connected directly to a private suite might be rerouted. A small room might be stripped of furniture and left unfurnished, its purpose no longer applicable. Silent witnesses, carpenters, electricians, groundkeepers, sometimes noticed that certain spaces seemed to exist on the plans but not in the day-to-day life of the estate. They learned quickly that questions about those spaces were not welcome. One worker later recalled a supervisor placing a firm hand on his shoulder, tilting his chin back toward the main façade and saying, almost kindly, "Look at what you are being paid to build, not at what has been quietly erased." As the estate grew, the weight on Marjorie's shoulders did not show up in headlines, but it did leave traces in them. Small gestures. During site visits, she could shift from animated conversation with her architect to a long, still silence when a rolled map was unfastened to reveal the lower-level layout. Her gloved hand might hover over a blank section labeled only with a room number, hesitate, then withdraw, leaving her attorney to tap the paper instead and discuss storage or archives. On one recorded afternoon, she walked through the half-finished main hall while workers hammered overhead, the air thick with dust. She paused beneath an archway that would later frame the view to the courtyard, listening not to the noise around her but to a quieter rhythm in the background, the scratch of pencil on paper in a side office, where someone was revising yet another schedule of rooms and uses. For a brief moment, she turned her face toward that sound, jaw set, then resumed her tour, voice calm as she commented on the light from the windows. In Beyond the Golden Halls, we often talk about forbidden rooms and erased records as part of the same architecture. Here, the logic of her inheritance and succession seems to bleed directly into stone. Legal arrangements about who would be recognized, who would inherit, and who would remain an unnamed shadow required more than signatures. They demanded physical places where papers could be reviewed in private, where conversations could occur unobserved. It is no coincidence that among the maps of Mar-a-Lago, there appears a small, windowless chamber, connected only to the master suite and a back service corridor, accessible through a door that later photographs refused to show. The notation beside it is clipped, "Private file room." In a later copy of the same plan, that label is gone, replaced by an innocuous number and a faint erasure mark, as if someone had pressed too hard while trying to make the old words disappear. The habits of the American elite at that time turned such spaces into instruments of control. Letters could be written here and burned here. Ledgers could be reviewed, amended, or quietly removed from circulation. Newspaper editors, grateful for access to lavish weekend gatherings, could be received in grand salons and steered away from the questions that mattered, while the real decisions took shape 2 floors away in a room whose existence they might never suspect. When rumors surfaced about contested inheritances or hidden heirs, those hidden heirs who did not match the luminous family portraits, statements were issued from law offices, not living rooms. Press agents were dispatched with carefully phrased clarifications that addressed everything except the actual suspicion. At Mar-a-Lago, the architecture itself seems to have been designed to support that choreography. Dazzling public spaces, carefully controlled thresholds, and what look suspiciously like pockets of silence built into the very walls. All of this came at a cost that the society columns never calculated. The financial burden of constructing such an estate was immense, even for one of the richest women in America, but the emotional burden shows up only in slivers. A gardener remembered seeing her stand alone near the edge of the property one dusk, the skeletal frame of the house behind her, the sea turning darker in front. She held a rolled blueprint in one hand, loosely, as if it had already given her all the answers it could. The wind picked up and tugged at the paper's edge, making it flap softly like a reluctant flag. She did not unroll it. She simply watched the horizon until an assistant appeared at her side and gently retrieved the plans, carrying them back up toward the bright, busy core of the construction site. From a distance, it looked like nothing more than an owner checking on progress. Up close, there was something about the way she let the paper go without a word that suggested an exhaustion deeper than cost overruns or design changes. Decades later, when researchers and archivists try to reconstruct the full story of Mar-a-Lago's creation, they run into familiar obstacles. City records list permits and inspections, but some early applications are missing attachments that are clearly referenced in later correspondence. A set of photographs taken during construction, preserved in a local historical society, includes a shot of a hallway with 3 doors. The final building has only 2 in that stretch of wall. Internal memos from contractors speak of work completed in restricted section per separate instructions, with no clarification. Even the surviving blueprints behave like living witnesses trained to say only so much. A line of ink fades right where an extra passage might have been. A notation is overwritten with a thicker pen, leaving a darker patch that conceals whatever was first written there. These are the traces that define a dark legacy more effectively than any dramatic confession. Not a single document openly declares what or whom Mar-a-Lago was built to shelter from view. But taken together, the restricted areas on the plans, the sealed doorways, the rooms that appear in some records and vanish in others, they suggest that the mansion was always intended to do more than host parties. It was built to contain something from the past that needed careful managing. Agreements made, names crossed out, relationships recast into language that could survive scrutiny. The house shines in photographs, a monument to wealth and taste. Its shadows, however, point toward stories that the architects of its image hoped would never be traced back to their source. And there, in the middle of one of those old construction maps, is a single detail that refuses to settle. In a later copy used for routine maintenance, a narrow doorway at the end of a private corridor simply does not exist. The wall is drawn as solid, the space beyond it reassigned to structural, but on an earlier, more fragile sheet, that same spot is marked with a tiny rectangle and a brief note written in a hand that appears nowhere else in the file. Access, records. Someone drew a firm line through those words years ago, pressing hard enough to dent the paper. Under oblique light, the indentation is still visible, as if the house itself remembers a passage that the official story insists was never there. The document that changes everything does not look dramatic at first glance. It sits in a gray archival box, sandwiched between routine correspondence about roofing, materials and import duties on European tiles. The paper is heavier than the others, cream-colored with a faint watermark that only appears when you tilt it toward the light. At the top, in careful typewritten lines, you see what appears to be another financing agreement, one more instrument in the machinery that made Mar-a-Lago possible. But a little lower, in the dense paragraphing and careful legal phrasing that defined the Gilded Age, a phrase surfaces that doesn't belong there, the kind of phrase that belongs in Golden Age secrets, not in a standard building loan. The heading is bland. Memorandum of Understanding regarding supplemental capital facilities. The date aligns neatly with the early stages of construction, when costs were beginning to outrun even Marjorie's substantial means. The first pages list predictable terms, amounts, disbursement schedules, collateral language that mentions securities, future income streams, and a certain real property situated between the lake and the ocean in Palm Beach, Florida. Only in the fourth paragraph does the contract take a turn. The lender, a figure whose name appears nowhere else in the easily accessible archives, a man linked by rumor to quiet railroad consolidations and off-the-books war contracts, extends unusually favorable terms, the kind of concession that would make even a wealthy heiress pause. In return, there is consideration of a non-financial nature, described in language so oblique it reads like code. Resolution of prior familial encumbrances, assurances regarding the disposition of disputed issue, cooperation in preserving reputational stability among certain parties of interest. During the High Gilded Age, this kind of euphemism was its own dialect. Elite families did not write hidden heirs or illegitimate children into contracts. They wrote encumbrances and clarifications of succession. They did not reference bribing editors. They proposed maintenance of favorable public narrative. On the margins of this particular agreement, in a hand that is almost certainly not Marjorie's, someone has penciled small check marks next to these phrases, as if tracking obligations that go far beyond brick and stone. A later hand has tried to erase those marks, but the graphite lingers, ghost-like. The dark legacy of those words is not in what they say, but in what they carefully avoid saying. At some point, this contract left the law office where it was drafted and arrived at Mar-a-Lago itself. One former staff member, whose recollections were recorded when they were already in their 80s, remembered an evening when the house was still new, its surfaces gleaming, its reputation untouched. In a small side room off the master suite, one of those almost forbidden rooms we now recognize as control centers, Marjorie sat at a narrow desk with a lamp casting a hard circle of light. The rest of the room remained in shadow, a locked cabinet, a stack of ledgers, a single chair pulled too far from the wall, as if someone had risen quickly and not bothered to push it back. On the desk lay a document in duplicate. She did not pace or weep. She traced the edge of the page with one gloved fingertip, then removed the glove and set it aside, pressing her bare hand flat over a section of text as if weighing it. Outside, the ocean wind rattled a window pane. Inside, the only sound was the soft rasp of a pen cap being removed. The elite of that period had perfected their own quiet methods of encobramento. When an agreement like this threatened to expose more than it concealed, the solution was rarely to destroy it outright. Instead, copies would be separated, one locked in a private safe, one consigned to a bank's vault, one kept in a law firm's off-site storage under a deliberately vague label. Index cards and archives would be retyped with neutral descriptions. Special Capital Facility, Post, became MISC Financial. File numbers were altered by a single digit, so that even a determined researcher might miss the relevant box. The public record showed only what was meant to be seen. The rest was scattered like fragments of a broken mirror, each reflecting only part of the truth. Silent witnesses, such as junior clerks and secretaries, carried the memory of what had once been whole, but their names rarely survived in any index. In that context, the presence of this contract, complete if scarred, feels almost like an act of defiance against the erased. records around it. The obscure financier named as counterparty appears in no society columns, but his initials surface in corporate filings tied to rail lines, shipping companies, and insurance trusts. His world overlapped with the Gilded Age aristocracy without ever fully entering its salons. Men like him handled the understructure of fortunes, making sure that estates could be built and reputations could stand, even when the ground beneath them had shifted. Lending to a woman like Marjorie on such generous terms would not have been an act of chivalry, it would have been a trade. The question is, what exactly moved in the other direction? The agreement hints at more than money. There is an entire clause devoted to the orderly settlement of pending questions of paternal acknowledgement, language that practically vibrates against everything we now know about hidden heirs in that era. The name of the individual concerned has been meticulously scraped away, razored off so cleanly that only a faint groove remains in the paper where the letters once lay. Under angled light, you can make out the vague shapes of two capital letters, nothing more. Beneath this scar, a typewritten amendment states that all parties agree that no public assertion shall be made contrary to the genealogical narrative presently accepted by society and the press. The words sit there, cold and careful, as if the house they helped fund were itself an instrument for keeping that narrative in place. In the public sphere, none of this surfaced. Newspapers portrayed Marjorie as a woman of vision, willing to invest her own resources in a property that would one day benefit the nation. Journalists invited to luncheons at Mar-a-Lago wrote about the view, the tapestries, the way the light moved across the ceilings in the afternoon. They did not write about the man who arrived by side entrance and left by car after midnight, or about the envelopes that changed hands on upstairs landings. Press manipulation had become almost a reflex for these families. Exclusive interviews granted in exchange for discretion, subtle threats of withdrawal of access when lines were crossed, quiet campaigns to redirect attention toward less sensitive scandals. If rumors arose about the true cost of Mar-a-Lago, not in dollars but in concessions, those rumors rarely survived beyond low murmurs in drawing rooms and the occasional half-sentence in a private letter. For Marjorie herself, the contract seems to have been both shield and blade. It secured the funds necessary to complete the estate at a moment when even her fortune had limits. But it also bound her to a version of events that required perpetual self-control. Staff recalled that, in later years, whenever correspondence from the financier's representatives arrived, the envelopes would be placed in a specific tray on her desk, never mixed with other letters. She would open them alone, read in silence, and then, without calling for assistance, take them to that same small room off the master suite. There, the door would close softly, and no one on the other side would hear what happened next, only the occasional faint crackle of paper near the fireplace or the metallic click of the safe. By the time this contract resurfaced in our own hands, the principal signatories were long gone. The lawyers who drafted it were dust. The clerks who filed it had no chance to explain why one copy bore revisions that the others did not. The narration you're hearing now is, in many ways, something revealed a century too late. What remains are patterns, the familiar alignment of dates, the careful matching of phrases across separate documents, the way certain details in family lore suddenly make more sense when read alongside this legal text. A child who appears briefly in a diary and then disappears, a charitable scholarship that begins the same year as the initial disbursement under this agreement, a sealed envelope found among old papers containing nothing but a baptismal certificate with no surname, and a Florida address written only as near the great house. Each piece alone proves nothing. Together they begin to outline the kind of bargain that could make even a powerful woman accept terms that narrowed her own moral horizon. And then there is the final page. Near the bottom, above the signatures, lies a short addendum in smaller type. It states that, in the event of dispute, certain personal records and proofs will be held in escrow in a designated location on the Mar-a-Lago property itself, accessible only to the parties or their designated heirs, and under no circumstances to be disclosed to public authorities without mutual consent. Someone has underlined that sentence twice in blue ink. Next to it, In the margin appears a single word, written in a neat, firm hand. Resolved. The ink has bled slightly into the fibers, as if the pen paused there. Just below, where another signature line should bear the name of the individual whose existence is so carefully implied throughout the contract, there is only a long, heavy stroke of ink from left to right. No letters, no initials, just a deliberate obliteration where a life was meant to be acknowledged. The line sits there on the page like a closed door that never appears on any blueprint, waiting for someone to finally ask what or who was once written beneath it. If you want to understand how deep a dark legacy can run, you don't start with the ballrooms or the guest lists. You start with the paperwork that was never meant to be read by anyone outside the bloodline. In families like Marjorie Merriweather Post's, the real story of who mattered and who did not was written not in the society pages, but in wills, codicils, and quiet memoranda, drafted in paneled offices far from Palm Beach. By the time Mar-a-Lago stood complete against the Florida sky, the question inside those offices was no longer just how to build a house, but who, in the end, would be allowed to call it theirs. The Gilded Age had already established the rules. Fortunes flowed along carefully drawn genealogical lines. Eldest sons of certain marriages inherited control. Daughters received curated portions. Children born in the wrong order, from the wrong union, or in the wrong kind of scandal were steered elsewhere with discreet settlements. That logic did not vanish as America stepped into the glamour of the Hollywood Golden Age. It simply changed. Vocabulary. Lawyers stopped writing legitimate and illegitimate and started writing recognized and otherwise provided for. When you look at the private family papers linked to Marjorie, you see exactly that shift. Early documents with blunt language slowly giving way to elegant phrases that hide as much as they reveal. Hidden heirs become beneficiaries under separate arrangement. Erased records become superseded drafts. And the line of succession hardens into something that looks clean until you notice what's missing. The file that cracks that illusion open comes from a family attorney's archive, the kind of place where Golden Age secrets go to sleep. Inside a worn leather folder labeled simply Estate Planning Revisions, there is a draft schedule of distribution that lists assets in tidy columns: securities, art, jewelry, real property, the residence known as Mar-a-Lago. Next to each category, names are typed in a crisp mid-century font, aligning neatly with the Mao expected heirs. But halfway down the page, just beneath a line assigning residual interests in the Palm Beach property, there is a gap. The spacing is wrong, a small blank space where another name should sit. Under angled light, impressions in the paper suggest that, at some point, another line of text was there and was removed. A later memorandum in the same folder tries to smooth over the absence. It refers to prior consideration of an additional lineal heir, now deemed inapplicable to the general scheme of distribution, and instructs that references to said party shall be omitted from final schedules. The language is careful, but its meaning, in the culture of these families, is devastatingly simple. Someone who once stood in line for a fragment of this empire has been written out. Not reassigned, not gently diminished, omitted. The name itself does not survive in this draft, but a small notation in the margin, a hastily penciled initial, half erased, suggests that whoever made this change did so under pressure. The graphite lingers like a smudge of conscience on the edge of the page. Witnesses from that world rarely speak openly, but their small remembered details lock into place around documents like these. A former governess, interviewed many years later, described how, for a brief period in the 1930s, one more place was set at table in a private breakfast room at Mar-a-Lago. The extra chair was placed not at the far end, but close, within a reach of Marjorie's right hand. There were mornings when she would rest her fingers lightly on the back of that chair before sitting, as if acknowledging a presence that everyone had been told not to name. Then, one season, the extra setting vanished. The chair was moved against the wall, and whenever the governess mentioned the change, the answer came in a tight, practiced phrase: "Arrangements have been made." No further explanation, no official announcement, just a subtle rearrangement of the physical space, matching a quiet reconfiguration on paper. In the logic of succession that governed these fortunes, such erasures were not accidents, they were strategies. To protect a legacy, you could not allow competing narratives of descent to linger in the background. Marjorie, by the time she had become the matriarch of this network, understood that all too well. The pressure was not simply to be fair, but to be consistent with the image upheld in public, the impeccably controlled family tree, the clear line from founder to designated heirs. The price of that clarity was paid in private. Staff remember those prices not as dramatic confrontations, but as changes in routines. A photograph removed from a hallway and replaced by a landscape. A trunk that once held childhood toys sent quietly away to storage. A name that once surfaced in a casual anecdote becoming conspicuously absent in later retellings. Silent witnesses watched these edits accumulate while the official story grew smoother, more polished, more incomplete. The machinery behind those edits extended into the institutions that kept records for the rest of us. In local courthouses, docket books list certain filings as withdrawn or sealed, with no further information. In one county archive, a clerk's log from the 1940s mentions a petition regarding affiliation and support connected to a surname that echoes one of Marjorie's former husbands, only for that entry to be crossed out in red ink and marked "entered in error." Subsequent pages contain no correction, no replacement, just blank space where the case should have appeared. Newspaper clippings from the same period show subtle signs of manipulation. A society column hinting at recent unpleasantness in a prominent family regarding inheritance expectations, followed, the next day, by a forced, overly cheerful correction, praising the unity and generosity of the very same household. The original column survives only in a damaged scrapbook. The official bound volume for that month, held by the paper, is missing those 2 pages altogether. Against this backdrop, Mar-a-Lago itself becomes more than a luxurious estate. It becomes a stage on which accepted heirs are displayed and others are conspicuously absent. Holiday photographs show smiling children on the terrace, their names carefully captioned in albums. Yet on the back of one print, buried deep in a private collection, an old pencil note identifies all 4 of them by first name, while only 3 faces appear in the frame. Below the note, another darker line of graphite runs through the word "for," pressing down hard enough to dig into the paper. Someone at some point decided that the image and the caption no longer matched the version of the family they were willing to preserve. And so the easiest solution was to scratch out a single digit, leaving 3 children in the official record and 1 more presence hovering in the subtext. This is the kind of detail that defines the hidden heirs. In our investigations here at Beyond the Golden Halls, their absence is everywhere and nowhere at once. A trust mentioned in a memo but not in the executed will, a reference to "we" in a private letter that doesn't match the number of publicly acknowledged offspring, a bequest in an early draft replaced later by a vague promise that separate provision has been made. The more you read, the clearer it becomes that someone in Marjorie's orbit faced precisely the kind of dilemma that turns legacies into mazes. Keep faith with a child who complicates the narrative, or protect the narrative that sustains the fortune itself. What would you do if you found something like this buried in the Gilded Age? If you opened a box and discovered that an entire life had been compressed into a single line of text and then struck out? Would you bring that erased record into the light or close the lid and walk away? For the generations that followed, the consequences of Marjorie's choices were felt. Less in open conflict and more in subtle distortions. Property lines shifted in ways that never quite aligned with oral family lore. A descendant who grew up overseas, always well taken care of, but curiously absent from formal genealogies, received regular payments from an anonymous trust whose origin their bankers could never fully explain. Family reunions at Mar-a-Lago revolved around carefully curated stories, tales of industry and philanthropy, of art collections and state dinners. While certain years in the family timeline were passed over quickly, smoothed out like wrinkles in a tablecloth before guests arrived. The forbidden rooms in these stories aren't always locked chambers behind hidden doors. Sometimes they are entire chapters of lived experience sealed shut by collective agreement. And then there is the artifact that ties all of this together, found not in a vault but in an old envelope at the bottom of that attorney's file. It is a single sheet of thick paper, folded and refolded until the creases have begun to crack. On it, in an older, more ornate hand than the sleek type of mid-century documents, is a family tree, an early attempt to map the Post dynasty and its branches. Names flow outward from the original fortune like lines drawn across generations. In one section, beneath Marjorie's, you can see where another branch once began, a name written in with the same ink and care as the others, connected by a neat line to the rest of the family. At some later date, someone returned to this page with a darker pen. The line has been obliterated with a series of hard, deliberate strokes, and the name beneath is no longer legible. Yet the pressure of those strokes has left a deep groove, and under the right light, the empty space where that erased heir once stood seems to rise from the paper like a shadow, insisting that the story of Mar-a-Lago can never be fully told without whatever was written there first. By the time the last scaffolds came down and Mar-a-Lago settled into its role as a shimmering landmark on the Florida coast, Marjorie Merriweather Post was no longer just an heiress with a vision. She was the visible center of a carefully engineered dynasty. From the outside, it looked almost effortless. Charity galas beneath painted ceilings, photographs of her shaking hands with politicians and foreign dignitaries, magazine spreads that framed her not as a relic of the Gilded Age, but as a modern matriarch of taste and influence. Yet if you follow the paper trail instead of the camera flashes, you see that this ascent was stitched together with risky loans, private guarantees, and contracts that bound not just her fortune, but the lives orbiting it to a narrow, unforgiving path. The same obscure financier whose name surfaces in the funding of Mar-a-Lago appears again in later documents, now not as a lender, but as a quiet guarantor of stability. Agreements signed in the 1930s and 40s speak of liquidity protections and contingent facilities, designed to keep the Post empire intact during downturns and wars. In exchange, there are clauses about continuity of stewardship and non-dilution of principal control, phrases that sound dry until you realize what they mean in practice. Certain heirs must not challenge the structure. Certain assets must remain concentrated. Certain stories about how all this was built must never reach the press. Golden Age secrets had become mid-century insurance policies. Inside Mar-a-Lago, that logic seeped into everyday life in ways visitors rarely noticed. Seating charts for dinners were not just about personalities. They reflected the invisible hierarchy of the dynasty in progress. At one long table, a chair closer to Marjorie might signal not affection but alignment. Someone who had agreed, in writing, to uphold a specific version of succession. In the library, where shelves carried leather-bound volumes and carefully framed photographs, there were drawers beneath. The bookcases that only her closest advisors opened. One guest later remembered wandering in by mistake during a quieter moment, finding Marjorie there with two men in dark suits. The air in the room was still. The only movement came from her hand as she adjusted a single page on the desk, turning it so both men could see a line near the bottom. She did not raise her voice. She simply tapped that line once with the tip of her finger, then looked up with a steady, unreadable gaze. The men nodded, one after the other, and the page disappeared into a waiting folder. Beyond the house, the machinery of dynasty building relied on institutions that most people trusted without question. Trust companies and banks managed the web of loans and investments that kept the estate's costs from swallowing the fortune whole. Lawyers drafted new instruments with each change in tax law, always aiming to keep control tight and visibility low. In one memorandum, a consultant advises strategic diversification of public narrative, recommending that Marjorie lean harder into philanthropy and cultural patronage to soften the sharp edges of her business and inheritance decisions. Almost immediately afterward, we see an uptick in high-profile donations, art to museums, funds to hospitals, support for wartime efforts. The same newspapers that might have sniffed around for scandal now ran columns praising her patriotism and generosity, effectively drowning out any whispers about hidden heirs or forbidden rooms in a tide of favorable ink. But if you listen closely to the quieter sources, the silent witnesses, you hear another story running beneath that applause. A long-serving housemaid recalled that, in her later years, Marjorie developed a habit of pausing at certain thresholds instead of walking straight through. On her way from the grand hall to the private wing, she would sometimes stop at a small plain door that most guests never noticed, hand hovering over the knob, without turning it. The maid, standing discreetly at the far end of the corridor, saw this more than once. A brief stillness, a slight tightening of the shoulders, and then a practiced pivot as Marjorie chose a different route. Whatever lay behind that door, storage, files, reminders of decisions made, had become a point of hesitation in a life that otherwise moved in straight, confident lines. The financial arrangements that propped up her dynasty were just as carefully staged. Accounting ledgers. From the period show temporary advances that were never repaid, special purpose entities that owned nothing but a slice of Mar-a-Lago on paper, and consulting fees that matched, almost to the dollar, the timing of inconvenient rumors. When a relative raised questions about their share in a private letter, the reply came not from Marjorie herself but from counsel, couched in polite phrases about the greater good of the estate and the importance of unified presentation before the public. At the same time, a flattering profile about her courage in weathering economic storms appeared in a national magazine, a reminder of how adept these families had become at manipulating the press to reinforce whatever narrative the dynasty required at that moment. Within the family, the cost of this constant calibration surfaced in small fractures. There were holidays when one branch of the family was conspicuously absent from Mar-a-Lago, their invitations said to have been lost in the post. There were visits cut short after private meetings behind closed doors, the departing relatives walking more stiffly down the front steps than when they arrived. Staff noticed that photographs on the piano changed over time, one group portrait replaced by another in which the arrangement of faces had shifted slightly. A person once standing at the center now relegated to the edge, or missing altogether. No one spoke openly of fights, but the house itself showed subtle signs of redecoration. A bedroom that once bore traces of a long-ago occupant repapered and refurnished, as if to erase any memory that it had ever belonged to someone specific. From the vantage point of archives, the ascent and the costs line up almost too neatly. The riskier the loans and contracts became, the more tightly controlled the family image grew. Minutes from a bank's internal committee meeting mention high concentration risk offset by exceptional collateral and reputation value, as if Marjorie herself had become collateral for her own dynasty. A later internal memo, written in the dry language of compliance, notes ongoing public goodwill generated by philanthropy and social prominence, a reminder that her ability to maintain the facade of a benevolent matriarch was not just personal branding, but a financial asset. The weight of those expectations, the fear of reputations shattered and legacies dismantled, hangs over every decision preserved in those manila folders. At a certain point, the story stops being about a single house and begins to look like a blueprint for how American dynasties survived the transition from the raw power of the Gilded Age into the subtler, televised authority of the mid-20th century. Strategic marriages, controlled scandals, hidden heirs quietly redirected, forbidden rooms where the real conversations took place, silent witnesses who watched documents go into fireplaces and safes. Marjorie's triumph was to ride that wave and remain standing. Her tragedy was that staying upright required balancing on a foundation made of other people's erased options. The more firmly she anchored Mar-a-Lago as the heart of her world, the more that house absorbed the tension between what was celebrated and what had been sacrificed. And in the end, at least in the part of the story we can touch, one object crystallizes that tension. In a storage room of a northern museum that inherited part of her art collection, there hangs a large family portrait that never makes it to the public gallery. At first glance, it is a typical image of dynastic confidence. Marjorie seated, Mar-a-Lago rendered softly in the background through an open window, her acknowledged heirs arranged around her. But as conservators examined the canvas under raking light, they noticed something beneath the layers of paint on the right side, a faint outline of another figure that no longer appears. The shape of a shoulder, the suggestion of a turned head, the ghost of a hand that once rested on the back of her chair. At some point, an artist was instructed to paint that presence out, replacing it with neutral drapery and empty space. Up close, the texture gives it away. A patch where the surface is slightly raised, the brush strokes more labored. From the gallery floor, you would never know. In the quiet of the conservation studio, under unforgiving light, you can see that someone stood there once, at the edge of Marjorie's carefully constructed dynasty, then vanished, leaving only the uneasy silence of a face that should be there and is not. The first hint that Mar-a-Lago still had something to say did not come from a ghost story or a family confession. It came from a measurement that refused to cooperate. On a recent preservation survey, a quiet, methodical architect laid an original construction blueprint from the 1920s beside a modern fire safety plan, and noticed that the numbers did not add up. The exterior dimensions of the estate matched, but on the inside, a strip of space simply vanished. A corridor on the older drawing ran several feet farther than any hallway in the present building. On the blueprint, that stretch ended at a small rectangle marked with a notation so faint it was almost lost, a symbol used in other Gilded Age mansions to denote a door to a service or restricted area. On the modern plan, that same spot was rendered as a solid wall, blank and unremarkable. In a house already rumored to contain forbidden rooms and hidden heirs, the discrepancy hung in the air like a question no one had thought to ask aloud. Access to the private sections of Mar-a-Lago has always been tightly managed, but preservation work, when framed as neutral, technical, safe, can open doors that remain closed to everyone else. Walking the corridor in question, the surveyor counted steps under their breath, matching them to the scale on the old drawing. The plaster looked seamless, the wainscoting continuous. Yet when a hand slid along the paneling, fingertips caught on a shallow, unnatural groove, as if two pieces of wood had once met there and been sanded down together. A slight change in sound followed, the difference between knuckles rapping on solid masonry and knuckles rapping on a hollow void. Someone had taken pains to erase the presence of a doorway, but the physics of the house remembered what the blueprints had been instructed to forget. In the world of Gilded Age mansions, secret spaces rarely existed for romance alone. They were designed with a careful logic, to protect valuables, to hide documents, to create routes through which members of a family could move unobserved. Contemporary accounts of other estates mention mirrored doors, rotating bookcases, narrow back passages that connected private suites to ground floor studies. At Mar-a-Lago, the pattern fits. Old staff logs include references to upper service access in an area where no staircase now appears. A faded maintenance note, written in the 1930s, mentions a north annex ventilation check, even though no such annex is labeled on the current plans. When archivists from beyond the Golden Halls overlay these scraps with the recovered construction maps, the outline of something unmistakable emerges. A small, self-contained wing running parallel to a section of the private quarters, accessible only through a now vanished door at the end of that misbehaving corridor. The first modern entry into that space did not involve dramatic smashing of walls. It began with a screwdriver and patience. Behind a wardrobe that had likely not been moved in decades, a narrow vertical seam became visible in the paneling, its paint ever so slightly a different tone. The wardrobe slid aside with a groan of protest, leaving marks in the dust that suggested it had once stood elsewhere. A hidden latch, long stiff with disuse, yielded under pressure, and a panel swung inward on rusty hinges, exhaling a breath of stale, cool air. The corridor beyond was narrow, barely wide enough for two people to pass, its floor covered in a layer of dust that preserved every footprint like a record. The first few steps sounded louder than they should have, heel against old tile echoing off walls that had not heard human movement in a very long time. This is where Golden Age secrets stop being metaphors and become architecture. The wing itself is modest by the standards of Mar-a-Lago's public grandeur. A short run of rooms, their windows shuttered from inside, shutters painted over from the outside to blend with the façade. There is a small sitting room with no decorative excess, only plain plaster, and a fireplace whose flue has long since been blocked. Off that, a narrower room holds built-in cabinets with empty shelves, the wood marked by the outlines of boxes or ledgers that once stood there. On one wall, at eye level, faint rectangles of lighter paint show where frames hung for years before being removed. A single nail remains, bent, a scrap of aged string still tied around it. The scene looks less like an abandoned guest suite and more like a place where someone once lived and worked in the shadow of the larger house, close enough to hear the music from the main hall and far enough never to be seen from it. Here, the logic of hidden heirs and forbidden rooms converges. In one drawer of a built-in desk stuck by a film of time, a folder has survived, its edges curled. Inside, rather than a tidy archive, there are fragments. The corner of a legal document with the word issue visible before the page was torn. A receipt from a small store in a nearby town, made out to a surname that never appears in the official list of Post heirs. A short note in a firm, compressed hand that reads only, "All visits to be arranged discreetly. Use the north entrance." The rest of the page has been cut away with such precision that whoever did it clearly knew exactly which lines needed to disappear. Erased records don't always mean bonfires and ash. Sometimes they look like this. Paper trimmed just where meaning begins. As investigators move through the wing, the signs of a deliberate sealing grow clearer. A bathroom has been stripped of fixtures. Only the outlines on the tile remain, like chalk outlines of missing porcelain. A wardrobe stands open and empty, but a careful look at the floorboards beneath reveals lighter planks in one rectangular section, as if a trunk or chest had sat there for years, shielding the wood from light. The bygone air carries a faint metallic tang near one wall, a suggestion of an old safe removed and the cavity bricked over. In the quiet, even small sounds become loud. The scrape of a shoe against dust, the soft crackle of old paint under fingertips tracing a crack. The house is not haunted in any cinematic sense, yet the atmosphere is thick with the kind of silence that comes after arguments that were never written down. The implications for Marjorie's story are immediate and uncomfortable. The existence of a sealed wing in a residence like this is not a neutral detail. It suggests that at some point, her dynasty required a physical space where certain people, documents, or decisions could be kept apart from the rest of her world. Was this where the escrowed personal records and proofs mentioned in that forbidden contract were once stored? Did someone live here? Someone whose connection to the family had to be close enough for access and distant enough for denial, for all the care with which her public image was managed. A hidden annex like this points to a private architecture built around fear. Fear of scandal, fear of legal challenge, fear that the neat lines of the family tree might be smudged by an inconvenient truth. As with every dark legacy we explore, silent witnesses emerge even here, in a place seemingly deserted. On a windowsill, beneath layers of dust, the faint ring of a glass is visible, as though someone once stood there often, placing the same cup down in the same spot while looking out through shutters that only opened inward. On a closet shelf, tucked behind a loose board, there is one last object the people who sealed this wing overlooked, a small leather-bound notebook with most of its pages torn out. Only the first sheet remains, half detached. In careful, deliberate script, a single sentence runs across it before stopping abruptly. This house was promised as... The remainder of the line is gone, ripped away with the rest, but the torn edge points toward a story in which Mar-a-Lago itself was once envisioned differently, promised not just as a showpiece, but as something owed perhaps to someone whose claim could never be spoken aloud. For now, the official tours still pass by that smooth stretch of corridor wall without a pause. Guests admiring the chandeliers and soaring ceilings, unaware that a few inches away, the outline of a door hides in the join between panels. The modern fire safety plan remains politely silent about the extra space, labeling what lies beyond as non-accessible. But in the sealed wing itself, on the inside of the panel that once opened into the main house, there is a detail no one outside the small investigative team has yet seen. A narrow brass plaque, tarnished almost black, screwed into the wood at eye level. Whatever name was engraved there has been scored over with a series of harsh, crossing lines, metal biting into metal, until only scratches remain. Under the beam of a flashlight, the gouged surface catches the light like a wound, marking the threshold not just of a forgotten hallway, but of a story Mar-a-Lago has been trying to keep locked away since the day that plaque was defaced and the door was nailed shut. By the time someone finally opened the cabinet in the sealed wing, the scandal that had once threatened to burn through the highest levels of American society was already a ghost. The hinges groaned in protest as the door swung outward, revealing not stacks of jewelry or hidden cash, but something far more dangerous to a dynasty: paper. 3 narrow boxes, the starch gray kind used by law firms, sat side by side on the shelf, their labels browned with age. On the front of each, written in a controlled, old-fashioned hand, was a single word: correspondence, schedules, and, on the last one, allocations. It is always that last word that tells you whether a Gilded Age fortune was merely large or large enough to require secrets. The story the elite told about themselves was polished over decades. Fortunes made in industry and food, philanthropy that softened steel edges, tasteful estates that became national talking points. But inside the box marked allocations, the myth starts to split. The first bundle is held together with disintegrating ribbon, each document numbered in pencil. At the top is a memorandum stamped confidential, not for file, addressed not just to Marjorie but to a cluster of names recognizable from other Golden Age secrets. Board members of major banks, partners at law firms that quietly served half the old money families on the East Coast, a senior figure linked to federal agencies whose reach extended far beyond Palm Beach. Their world crossed in private more often than the public record admits. What these people wanted from Marjorie was not simply discretion about an awkward heir or a risky loan. The document lays out a coordinated arrangement. Certain assets in her control, shares, bonds, overseas holdings connected to wartime contracts, had to be moved into vehicles that would never face public scrutiny. In exchange, those same men would ensure that inquiries into the origins of her wealth and into the irregularities around Mar-a-Lago's financing would never progress beyond routine interest. There is a sentence buried in the middle of dense text that makes the stakes clear. In light of potential exposure of arrangements beneficial to multiple parties of the present elite, it is understood that Mrs. Post's cooperation will safeguard not only her position, but the stability of the broader system. In other words, if she fell, she would not fall alone. There are hints that the pressure was not subtle. A later note, written in quicker, less controlled script, records a meeting at Mar-a-Lago itself. The location is specified: small library off West Corridor, a room that sits uncomfortably close to the sealed wing on the old plans. The attendees are listed by initials only, but the list aligns neatly with the names on that earlier memorandum. The description of the meeting is stripped of emotion, but the choreography leaks through. Mrs. P. reticent segregation of certain items, reminded of mutual interest in avoiding examination of historic contracts and familial arrangements, emphasized potential reputational damage for all concerned if correspondence or escrow materials were to come under review. Mrs. P. agreed to revised schedule. No threats quoted, no raised voices recorded. Just the quiet understanding that reputations, fortunes, and perhaps entire family trees could be rearranged with a few signatures and a shared fear of the spotlight. In the context of the Gilded Age and its long shadow, this is exactly how crises were managed. When scandals threatened to touch the families who sat atop banking trusts, railroad combines, or food empires, they rarely erupted into full public view. Instead, the elite deployed a familiar toolkit: friendly. Editors who knew which stories not to pursue, prosecutors whose enthusiasm could be dialed up or down with a single phone call, charitable endowments announced at suspiciously convenient moments. The confidential file from Mar-a-Lago shows that Marjorie was not merely a beneficiary of this system. She was, at a critical moment, drafted into its maintenance. By accepting the terms set out in those pages, she helped shelter not only her own dark legacy of hidden heirs and forbidden rooms, but the overlapping secrets of men whose names still adorn institutions today. The cost of that protection surfaces in scattered traces. In the box labeled schedules, calendar entries suddenly grow thicker in the years after the agreement. Breakfasts with bank presidents, informal lunches with politicians, evenings hosting committees for museums and hospitals. The face she presented to the world in those photographs, the gracious hostess in the shimmering hall, became part of the cover that kept anyone from asking why certain parts of her fortune had vanished from public balance sheets. Meanwhile, the sealed wing remained sealed, its cabinets absorbing the weight of documents that could have untied the knot binding her to that web of power. The dark legacy of Mar-a-Lago was no longer just personal, it had become systemic. Silent witnesses, as always, linger at the edges. A chauffeur remembered driving her to an unlisted office in New York on a foggy morning, the car stopping at a side entrance instead of the front. She stepped out without her usual entourage, carrying a slim leather case. When she returned hours later, the case was gone, and her gloves, normally pristine, bore faint smudges of ink along the fingers. A secretary recalled being instructed to type a letter with unusual care, using a specific kind of thin paper, then to make only one carbon copy and hand both directly back to Marjorie. No duplicates allowed. The letter itself does not survive, but an index card from the same period bears a telling title: Consolidation of Understanding Among Parties to Prior Arrangements. Whatever was agreed that day was meant to live in the memories of a handful of people and in a file like the one we are now finally opening. And this is where the scandal widens beyond one house and one woman. Among the documents in the correspondence box is a letter stamped with the letterhead of a major institution, one whose name still signals respectability. It thanks Marjorie, in courteous, distant language, for her continued alignment with the broader interests of stability and confidence. It notes, almost in passing, that the resolution of certain genealogical ambiguities has been appreciated, and that the shielding of certain gains from undue scrutiny has preserved the public's trust in crucial sectors. When you read between those lines, the message is clear. By hiding what could have been exposed about her fortune and her family, she helped preserve a façade that benefited the entire upper tier of American power. If this file had surfaced in her lifetime, or even in the generation after, the explosion would have reached far beyond Mar-a-Lago. Investigators would have found the trail of hidden heirs, forbidden rooms, erased records and coordinated cover-ups stretching across cities and decades. Board memberships, judicial appointments, even legislative decisions might have been re-examined in the light of who was paying whom to stay quiet. The scandal would not have been a simple story of one heiress caught in hypocrisy. It would have revealed how deeply the Gilded Age elite had built their Golden Age secrets into the structure of modern America. Her reputation would have shattered, yes, but so would the carefully curated myths of many others. Standing in that sealed wing today, with the boxes open and the dust disturbed, the question becomes uncomfortably personal. Would you have the courage to access a file like this if it were placed in front of you, knowing that opening it might not only rewrite the story of Marjorie Merriweather Post, but shake the polished names on banks, universities, and foundations? Or would you, Like so many silent witnesses before, close the lid, slide the box back into the dark and tell yourself that some legacies are better left intact, even if they rest on buried truths. That is the choice every historian, every archivist, every curious visitor in a house like this eventually faces. Because, at the very bottom of the last box, beneath the memoranda and schedules, there is one more artifact. It is a thick, sealed envelope, its flap secured with a strip of brittle, yellowed wax pressed with a signet that once belonged to one of those powerful allies. Across the front, in ink now fading toward brown, a single instruction has been written: to be opened only in the event of formal inquiry, otherwise destroy unread. The envelope is still intact. No one, as far as we know, has yet broken the wax. It lies there on the shelf in the secret wing of Mar-a-Lago, an object that contradicts every official reassurance that there is nothing left to find, waiting in a silence so heavy that you can almost hear the question it carries. What story, once opened, might finally bring down more than just one woman's carefully arranged world? The last contract does not come out of the sealed envelope with any flourish. It slides free with a dry whisper, heavy paper against heavier paper, and for a moment it looks like all the others that have carried this story from the Gilded Age into the quieter corridors of the 20th century. Same watermark, same careful type, same margins. Only when you look closely does it start to feel like the point where all those Golden Age secrets finally tighten into one decision. The heading is deliberately vague. Agreement regarding disposition and continuity of certain assets and properties. No mention of Mar-a-Lago by name, no mention of hidden heirs, no melodrama. But every line beneath is a thread running straight through the forbidden rooms and sealed cabinets we've been walking through together. It is signed late, decades after the first stones of the house were laid, at a time when tax laws had changed, public scrutiny had sharpened, and dynasties like hers were learning that what they built in private might, one day, be dragged into the light. On the surface, the contract appears to formalize a transfer, portions of her fortune, and the estate itself, moving into trusts, foundations, and designated custodial entities. The language promises stability, preservation, even a kind of immortality for the property. But tucked between those promises are clauses that echo everything we've already found in the sealed wing. Affirmation of prior understandings regarding genealogical narratives, permanent non-disclosure of escrowed materials, irrevocable waiver by all parties of claims inconsistent with the present line of succession. The ink is calm, the implications are not. You can almost reconstruct the room where it was signed. Not a courtroom, not a boardroom, but a smaller, softer space. Perhaps that side library off the west corridor at Mar-a-Lago, the one that sits uncomfortably close to the hidden annex. A handful of men in dark suits, a table cleared of everything but the pages, and a fountain pen laid precisely in the center. Outside, the house would have been in its usual performance, staff moving quietly, sea light over tiled roofs, the façade still playing its role as a symbol of taste and philanthropy. Inside, a woman who had spent a lifetime learning the weight of signatures rests one hand on the back of a chair before sitting, as if borrowing steadiness from the furniture. There is no speech recorded, no confession, only the small choreography of hesitation before the final stroke of her name. In the logic of American dynasties, this is how a dark legacy is both buried and preserved. The contract folds together the risky loans that built Mar-a-Lago, the confidential allocations that protected more than just her fortune, the erased records of those hidden heirs we traced through half-torn family trees. In exchange for locking all of that behind legal armor, she agrees to terms that bind her even more tightly to the system that once cornered her. Perpetual silence about the contents of certain files, formal recognition of a line of heirs that excludes anyone whose existence might crack the story, transfer of archival materials of a sensitive nature to an entity controlled by the same circle of men who once asked for her cooperation. The public will see only the surface, trust established, charitable gifts made, a beloved property secured for the future. The rest remains for silent witnesses and careful readers to piece together. And this is the part that feels revealed too late. By the time this contract surfaces in the boxes of the sealed wing, everyone who negotiated it is gone. The law firms have merged, the banks have rebranded, the newspapers that once printed flattering profiles have moved on to new patrons. What remains is this artifact that bridges two eras, written in the language of the old Gilded Age but filed in the age of television, designed to keep both worlds from colliding. It confirms what the confidential memorandum only implied, that Marjorie was willing to sign away not just pieces of her fortune but the possibility that the truth about her house and her family might ever be told while any of them were alive to answer for it. Protect the empire, even if that protection hardens into a cage around your own story. The last page is where everything tightens. A schedule of properties lists the residence located between the lake and the ocean in Palm Beach, Florida, as a central asset, its future tied to the maintenance of public confidence in the character and legacy of its founder. Beneath that, in smaller type, a writer specifies that all ancillary materials, correspondence, proofs, genealogical drafts, escrowed testimony, shall be either retained under seal by the designated custodial entity or destroyed in accordance with its judgment, provided that no such action shall disturb the continuity of the presently acknowledged narrative. In one sentence, the fate of every hidden document and every unacknowledged life connected to Mar-a-Lago is placed in the hands of a structure designed not for truth, but for continuity. And then, at the very bottom, where the signatures line up, there is a detail that refuses to sit quietly. Marjorie's name appears in full, written in a steady hand that has done this many times before. Opposite hers, the institutional signatory, a trust or foundation whose title you would recognize instantly, has been penned in by an authorized officer. But between them, on a third line that should belong to whoever once stood just outside the frame of the dynasty, there is only the long stroke of ink. Not the clean blankness of omission, but a name that was written and then obliterated. Letters dragged out of existence by a pen pressed too hard, leaving the paper scarred and slightly torn. Under the harsh light of an archive table, that blackened line looks less like a mere correction and more like a final act of erasure, the last visible trace of someone whose absence made this contract and this entire carefully arranged world possible. In the end, it isn't a lawyer or a banker who has the last word from Mar-a-Lago. It's a sheet of thin, cream-colored paper, folded twice and slipped into the back of a devotional book that once sat on the table beside her bed. The ink has browned with age. The handwriting is unmistakably hers, controlled, elegant, with the occasional hesitation where the pen has paused a fraction too long. The letter is undated, but the references inside place it near the time of that final contract, when her public role as matriarch was most polished and her private negotiations most suffocating. She never calls it a confession. Instead, she writes as if addressing someone who will arrive long after the last gala has ended. "You will hear that this house was my triumph," she begins, "but you will not be told what it cost or whom it was once promised to." The paragraphs that follow move in careful circles, the way a woman raised inside Gilded Age rules learns to speak plainly without naming names. She admits that agreements were signed to keep certain histories from reaching the newspapers, that hidden heirs were provided for out of sight so that the line on paper would remain clean, that Mar-a-Lago became less a home than a fortress built to keep a story from collapsing. She does not ask forgiveness. She simply notes that the contracts protecting her fortune also closed doors that were never drawn on any blueprint, and that the silence she kept was not all my own. Between the lines, you can feel the weight of those Golden Age secrets pressing on the page, the forbidden rooms, the silent witnesses, the erased records that turned her into both beneficiary and prisoner of a dark legacy she helped maintain. Near the end, the script wavers slightly. She writes that if anyone ever finds this letter, they should remember that the public portrait you inherit was arranged by many hands, and that the truth of Mar-a-Lago belongs as much to those written out as to those framed above the fireplaces. Then she does something none of her contracts ever allowed. She leaves a blank space where a name should be, followed by a single unfinished line. "This house was never meant to be only mine. It was also—" The sentence stops abruptly, the pen trailing off into a faint scratch as if she reconsidered, or someone approached the door. Beneath it, pressed flat between the last page and the back cover of the book, lies a small, tarnished key on a fragment of ribbon. Its tag once bore initials, but they have been rubbed away to a gray smear, leaving only the metal and the unspoken suggestion that somewhere in Mar-a-Lago there is still a lock waiting to answer a question her letter could only dare to ask in silence. Today, Mar-a-Lago lives more in headlines than in hushed parlors, but the house still carries the fingerprint of the Gilded Age in its bones. Tour guides talk about architecture and politics. Archivists, quietly, talk about something else. In university, reading rooms, and climate-controlled vaults, new boxes keep arriving. A stray ledger page from a trust company, a misfiled letter from a law firm, an estate inventory that doesn't quite match the official version. Each discovery tugs one more thread in the tapestry of Marjorie Merriweather Post's life, reminding us that her story is not a closed chapter, but a case file still being updated in real time. What once was managed through private visits and whispered understandings is now picked apart through digitized archives, freedom of information requests, and the patient work of historians trained to read silence as carefully as ink. The pattern that emerges is larger than one heiress. When you overlay these fragments, you see how Golden Age secrets flowed forward into the institutions we still trust. Banks quietly absorbing assets whose origins are never discussed. Foundations built on capital shielded by those contracts we opened in the sealed wing. Public narratives polished by press offices that learned their craft in an era of railroad barons and food empires. Hidden heirs become case studies in modern genealogy. Forbidden rooms at Mar-a-Lago become metaphors in academic articles about architecture and power. Even now, legal teams bristle when certain questions are asked too directly, and some files remain temporarily unavailable in archives that pride themselves on access. The past of the American elite keeps brushing against the present, reminding us that a dark legacy does not dissolve just because its original witnesses are gone. It lingers in policy, in precedent, in the quiet assumptions about who belongs where. For beyond the golden halls, Marjorie's unfinished letter and that final contract are not an ending, but a map. Each time a researcher stumbles on a misfiled blueprint, a memo about erased records, or a photograph where a figure has clearly been painted out, the investigation tightens around the same questions she tried to address without naming them. Who pays the price for a spotless dynasty? How far will a family or a class go to keep their story straight? And how many silent witnesses does it take before someone admits that the official version no longer fits the evidence? In conferences and documentaries, in late-night conversations between archivists, Marjorie's name now stands less for a glamorous socialite and more for the uncomfortable hinge between private power and public memory. Somewhere, as you hear this, another locked drawer will open, a private collection donated to a museum, an old law office finally cleared out, a family attic surrendered by heirs who no longer wish to carry the weight of their own golden age. Inside there may be nothing, or there may be a single object that refuses to align with the polished legend. A framed family portrait of Mar-a-Lago's terrace in the 1930s, its surface darkened by varnish, awaiting restoration. Under ultraviolet light, the conservator will see it first, the faint outline of a fourth figure at Marjorie's side, a face that was painted over decades ago. As solvent touches canvas, the erased profile begins to reappear, and for a long moment, the studio goes very quiet, because that half-returned face contradicts every official caption that ever named who stood in that scene, and every story that insisted there were only 3 heirs in the picture all along. So here we are, back in that dim conservation studio, standing before a portrait that was never meant to speak this. Loudly. The solvent has done its work. Beneath the varnish and careful overpainting, the faint outline of that fourth figure at Mar-a-Lago's terrace has begun to surface again. A shoulder where there should be empty air, a hint of a profile turned toward Marjorie, the ghost of a hand once resting near her chair. The official record still insists there were only 3 heirs in that scene, yet the canvas now tells a different story. One that galleries, registries, and family archives quietly chose not to repeat. Around that single image, the rest of the evidence falls back into place like drawers sliding shut. Contracts folded into private files, genealogies revised, forbidden rooms sealed behind smooth paneling, silent witnesses aging into the kind of silence that no longer answers questions. The Gilded Age may be gone, but its Golden Age secrets still breathe through these objects, each one a reminder that Marjorie Merriweather Post's legacy was not simply inherited wealth and elaborate ceilings, but a dark tapestry of hidden heirs, erased records, and carefully negotiated silence. What we see now is only what decades of encobramento failed to destroy. As the lights dim in these metaphorical halls and the doors of Mar-a-Lago's past close once more for tonight, the investigation does not end. It simply retreats back into the stacks. Somewhere, additional pages wait in mislabeled folders, and another portrait hangs under too thick varnish, holding its own forbidden rooms and darks. Legacy out of sight a little longer. If you wish to be present when the next misfiled blueprint is unrolled, or when the next sealed door finally opens, stay with us, so that you're here when the next sealed door finally opens. Leave your thoughts below. Every perspective helps illuminate what history tried to bury, and sometimes it is a viewer's question that points the way to the next overlooked archive. If this story resonated with you, let us know. It tells the algorithm these forgotten halls are worth exploring again, that there is still an audience for the quiet work of listening to what old houses and old papers are trying, at last, to say. And if you're willing to step deeper into the shadows, the next chamber awaits, with another dynasty, another façade, another set of names that never made it onto the family tree. Some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth. And in the long corridors between what was recorded and what was erased, Mar-a-Lago still stands like a locked door at the end of history's hallway, waiting for the next hand brave enough to try the handle.